Wow, an exciting week. I found some, I believe, historical evidence. Some, it's hard to believe, so some of it I have to discount, but some of it is quite credible that links Saint Germain to the American Revolution. And he enjoyed the nickname Uncle Sam at one point. We'll get into this in the next, after we finish with this the French Revolution with this article. Maybe I'll do a little thing on that. And that he was apparently present at the signing of the Declaration of Independence and gave a speech a couple of days before, ahead of that, to motivate the the um, the assembly to take the leap and to declare independence. And he was kind of a mysterious figure there who was described in terms and absolutely consistent with what in the very early videos, describing the Count physically and his nature, his bearing. So it's kind of exciting that he was also instrumental in designing the American flag. And he was known as the Professor. He did almost assuredly he had a friendship with Benjamin Franklin, but he also knew Thomas Jefferson and George Washington. So, the God of freedom. God or man, myth or reality, or both, somewhere in the middle. So look forward to that. I'm looking forward to getting into it. And now let's go back. With such a temptation to get off course and go into all of that relating to the American Revolution, because it does feed into the French Revolution. The idea that it was the same impulse, or that the impulse behind the original intended transition from an absolute monarchy to a constitutional monarchy was taken, the inspiration was taken from the American Revolution. I think that we can safely assume to be true. So it wouldn't be completely off topic, but I have to kind of stick to this because this little lyrical digression is taking a lot of time. I find that it is extremely pertinent not only to Saint Germain, who is not discussed in this article at all, but this is, I believe, an important backdrop, important facts, important history that's been deliberately scrubbed from the books that we are told to digest in universities and high schools. And we can't overlook the significance of why this information has been suppressed. I believe it's all of a piece what was done to obscure the ugly contrivances that precipitated the descent into madness that became the terror. That many of these same kinds of operations are being played out or attempted in the United States, although I don't think it will succeed still. It's a nail biter. It's a nail biter. So let's go on here. Sometime prior to 1789, the Duc d'Orléans had been recruited to British intelligence by Lord Shelburne. Kind of like Lord Shelburne was the mafia, the Don, the Doge of London, the head oligarch, the head of the snake. Lord Stanhope and Dr. Price, I don't know who Dr. Price is, who created with him the Society of the Revolution. Very interesting. Sound familiar? The tone of it to the sorts of groups that are being propped up, being run in the United States, how they have affiliations with shadowy figures that the average person has no idea about. This sounds very of and by the people, doesn't it? Society of the Revolution, but it's something entirely different. Society of the Revolution. This was the Jeremy Bentham-run British intelligence wing, the Jacobin Society, that helped organize the French Revolution, and whose purpose was to establish similar revolutionary groups in England, Ireland, and Scotland. The political wing of this Orléans network was represented in government by opposition party leader Charles James Fox, the opponent of William Pitt the Younger. Orléans' plans were totally in accordance with the Court of St. James' strategy to destroy France. And I've seen this elsewhere, and I'll look for it, the idea that the French Revolution was carried out by British assets to destroy France. And then later on, the history books dress it up as something noble. So I'll read that again. Orléans' plans were totally in accordance with the Court of St. James' strategy to destroy France, period. Orléans' most important asset from the higher ranks of the British oligarchy was John Frederick Sackville, Duke of Dorset, Ambassador Extraordinaire of King George III to France in 1789. The following incident reveals how the famine created by Orléans was orchestrated with the witting complicity of the King of England himself. So, very ugly business here. Get ready. I find this just absolutely atrocious. It's just painful to even read this next section. In May 1789, the news had been circulating all over Europe that England had secured an extraordinarily large reserve of grains. Faced with the severe shortages in France, Louis XVI personally wrote to a minister at the Court of St. James asking the British government to sell him a very modest supply of 20,000 sacks of wheat. The minister replied that he could not take that decision upon himself, but that he would plead with Messrs. Pulteney, Wolson, and Wilberforce, and Major Scott, telling them that this good neighborly gesture would go a long way to improve relations between the two countries. Immediately, William Pitt the Younger sounded the alarm in Parliament, and after some debates, requested that the export request be forwarded to the King's Privy Council. The Privy Council decided to establish a parliamentary commission to study the proposal, and ultimately the request was denied. Yes, they always have to study it, don't they? What should be a very simple, straightforward thing, but the studying the proposal is always kind of a prolonged period where they absolutely torture the poor souls waiting on the other end, and then ultimately disappoint them, as they did in later on in the Bolshevik Revolution, when the Tsar had expected money to help in his cause against the so-called revolutionary forces that were being pumped up by the same people who were then pulling out the rug from under him. So anyway, going back, Montjoie wrote, not only was this help rejected, but the refusal was so harsh that a strict rule was further passed against any contraband or any fraud that might elude this edict. Thus the British, stuffed with our grains, mercilessly refused this poor Louis XVI a slight portion of the sustenance that they had stolen from his own people. This rejection simply added to an already ravaging famine, and it was from that situation that the insurrection of July 14th emerged, and the heinous crimes of October 5th and 6th. It was only in October 1789 that the Duc d'Orléans decided to selectively repatriate some of the grain from England. Interesting note down here. The crimes of October 5th and 6th relate to the assassination attempt against Queen Marie Antoinette by the Duc d'Orléans, an action which would cause the Queen to force Orléans to be exiled to England. Why he couldn't have just been, put to death is beyond me, but poor Louis XVI. Hapless. Moving on. 5. The Necker-Orléans Bastille coup. Further historical evidence that the storming of the Bastille was a coup d'etat has been provided by Antonio Capello, ambassador of Venice to Paris in July 1789. His recently published dispatches indicate, remember this article is from 2003, recently published dispatches. Sometimes they reveal this information, but at a point so far in the future that it has very little consequence. His recently published dispatches indicate that the Venetians were well informed of the British Jacobin connection operation in Paris. Were well informed of the British Jacobin operation in France, and that Capello was briefed regularly by the Duke of Dorset, ambassador of England to Paris. Capello reported to the Doge that indeed it was the Swiss-British agent Jacques Necker, Minister of Finance, who had planned the insurgency of 100,000 foreign troops against Paris as a strategy of tension in preparation for the storming of the Bastille. Absolutely dirty business, isn't it? In turn, this Bastille coup d'etat became the smokescreen aimed at overshadowing the historic tennis court oath of June 20th, 1789, which had established the authority of the National Assembly founded by Bailly and Lafayette in agreement with the principles of Benjamin Franklin's American Revolution, which is why they were eager to overshadow it. Quite sure. The intelligence reports from Capello show clearly that he was aware that the uprising was not spontaneous. And we're seeing this in the United States now, these so-called riots or upright protests, right? They seem like an organic response to a random event, which the event was certainly not random. Anybody with a brain who looks at the facts of the case, and then the subsequent riots, not organic. They were engineered, kind of like setting up dominoes, right? George Floyd, fake event, then an engineered cascade of low-level domestic terrorism conducted by persons at a distance. And it's nothing new. The intelligence reports from Capello show clearly that he was aware that the uprising was not spontaneous and that there existed a carefully laid plan behind the storming of the Bastille. On July 20th, 1789, Capello sent the following revealing dispatch number 189. Will you read from that now? Never was there a revolt against a sovereign which had been better conducted, never was so little bloodshed, and never had a revolt been terminated so rapidly. The reason for the rally of these troops surrounding Paris and at Versailles was no longer a mystery. The aim was to give military support to the exile of Necker, force the dissolution of the Estates General, and declare national bankruptcy. Again, more echoes with current events, the planned demolition of the United States economy, which they haven't succeeded in doing, but they certainly have tried with this COVID-19 nonsense, shutting down the economy, which had more lethal effect, more deleterious effects on society than this piddling virus. But the whole idea was to bring down the economy. Here, they're trying to declare national bankruptcy. course, Trump is not letting them get away with it, and things are bouncing back, and the stock market is doing well. In this case, in the time of the French Revolution, they didn't have, Louis XVI was completely clueless as to what was going on. And I don't think he even had it in his mind, in his makeup, to even contextualize an engineered famine being directed at a large population. Moving on, without any resistance, a great quantity of guns and ammunition were taken, as well as a great quantity of flour which had been stored there for the soldiers. From there, the Parisians, went to the arsenal, where they took everything they could find. Thus, armed with rifles, cannons, and gunpowder under the direction of the French guards, the order to storm the Bastille was given, because one is not master of Paris unless he is master of that castle. Mr. Delaunay, the governor of the Bastille, had already received the order to defend himself with his soldiers and to fire on the people. He had already been assured of receiving, within 24 hours, a reinforcement of 10,000 men through underground passages that extended up to 5 miles. The fatal plan of the ministry, the which had failed momentarily, was conceived like this. In the night of Monday, between the 13th and the 14th of this month, July, the plan was to bring troops into Paris by fire and sword through Montmartre Hill, with the intention of creating a terrible massacre, such that the citizens would have been prepared to defend themselves with cannons and rifles, since the entire city would have been given arms. You see the same very low-level version of this being played out in the U.S. It could escalate, but I doubt that it will. These so-called black militia gangs springing up. Again, I'm sure they're completely artificial. So, going on, barricades had been erected to stop cavalry charges, and even the women had assembled in the houses a huge quantity of rocks and heavy boards to throw down at the soldiers. And of course, reading that, when I read that, it reminded me of the so-called protests in the wake of the George Floyd fake event, where people discovered these very odd pallets of bricks that were deposited behind buildings and at various strategic places where the protests were to take place. And these paid mercenaries, also known as protesters, were instructed as to where they could find these pallets of bricks and then avail themselves of these bricks to destroy local businesses and wreak havoc and create a bunch of street theater. It just reminded me of that. In one district, a motion was introduced, which was fortunately rejected, in which proposed that the blood princes and the ambassadors form, as it were, an initial front line in order to stop the enemy troops. You will find enclosed a copy of that motion. However, the fear which prevailed at Versailles was that 100,000 armed Parisians were expected to attack the king's palace. The storming of the Bastille thwarted the plan. So many defensive means had been deployed so quickly. The defection of a non-negligible part of the troops which were sent to the city, all of this made it clear that the ministry's plan was impossible to execute, and that there were not enough troops to send against 20 million unified subjects. In view of these disasters, the National Assembly sent on that same Monday a deputation to the king to explain the horrible situation in the capital, imploring him to withdraw the troops. If one pays attention to the intention here, the truth is easily unraveled. just by lifting slightly the veil of Capello's dispatches, it becomes evident that fear was the manipulating element on both sides of the irregular warfare operation. On the one hand, Necker and Dorset created a panic in Versailles where the king expected the assault of 100,000 enraged Parisians. On the other hand, the Duc d'Orléans created a panic in the half-starved Paris population with the invasion of 100,000 foreign troops, presumably under the king's order, and then the unexpected diversion, the Bastille. After he had become mayor of Paris in 1790, Bailly reportedly said to the king that the famine of that year had been orchestrated by the Duc d'Orléans. Quote here, "I did not hide the fact from him that the famine had been more or less fabricated." Tragic. But certainly the engineering of extreme social chaos and kinetic clashes and violence is part of the modus operandi in the case of this cadre of evildoers, up to their old tricks yet again with the militia movements and pitting races against one another and ideologies against one another, and just seeing how much havoc they can wreak. Orléans' assassination attempt against the king, and this is riveting. And I see echoes of this in the calls for and the attempts on Trump's life. In his account of the Orléans conspiracy, Montjoie reports that during the first few days after the storming of the Bastille, everything had been readied for the Duc d'Orléans to take power, and that even Necker had been literally bought by him. What is that note there? What? Although, this little note at the bottom of the page 54, although Capello lied by insinuation about the secret council of Bailly at the National Assembly and about Lafayette and his Paris militia involvement in the storming of the Bastille, and made the stupid romantic judgment that the storming of the Bastille was, quote, a noble revolt, he nonetheless revealed the truth about the well-conducted plan and the role of the ministry. Okay, so anyway, moving on. This idea that Necker was the only one who could regenerate France was thrown to the public by the party of Orléans with such zeal. And you see the same thing today in the United States. People say, you know, we have to go in the direction of the globalists, the WHO, you know, the UN, the IMF, central banking, all of these. Well, you know, they know what's best. They will help us out. We need them. And Necker is certainly an agent of the that same mindset, that same clique, that same kind of global. I guess at that time you could characterize it as maybe global imperialism. We would call it today globalism. And that this is pushed on people, and now, you know, Americans are so soft-headed, they're just falling all over themselves trying to worship and demonstrating their obedience to things like wearing a mask and vaccinations. It's absolutely appalling. So this idea that Necker was the only one who could regenerate France was thrown to the public by the party of Orléans with such zeal and with such success that it became the dominating idea The Third Estate, the clergy and the nobility, all of the bodies, and what is scarcely conceivable, even the Parliament itself, which had grave causes of discontent with this man, all feverishly desired to see Necker reinstated as the head of the finances. Necker, who did not ignore the fact that this general favor was primarily owed to Orléans, saw himself pushed by gratitude into the faction of that prince who looked upon him as his creature, and concurred that in all opportunities he could count on his devotion. So what went wrong? Why did the Duc d'Orléans not come to Paris the day after the storming of the Bastille and claim the crown as planned? The day had been fixed, the moment had been chosen, the multitude of the people were in the streets clamoring for him. On July 12th, the two busts of Necker and Orléans were paraded in the streets of Paris with chants of "Long live Necker, long live the Duke of Orléans." Yet Orléans was nowhere to be seen. The Count of Virieu reported that on July 17th he was told by a Parisian that, quote, the National Assembly was in danger, and that if there was an opportunity, and if there was an attempt on any of the deputies' lives, the majority of the population was ready to proclaim the Duke of Orléans either as protector of the nation or as lieutenant general of the kingdom. Unquote. Paris was in a state of convulsion, yet the leader of the mob was not there. Even the Duke of Aumont, a peer of the realm who appeared to be ignorant of the Orléans conspiracy, proposed to lead the people himself, but without succeeding. The population applauded him, but the electors of Paris, paid by Orléans, refused to grant him the signed authorization to become the commander-in-chief of the Paris armed forces. Still, Orléans did not show up. Where was he? The answer is simple. Orléans had gone to Versailles on the morning of the 15th to ask the king for a safe passage to England. Orléans said to the king, "Sir, I come to implore your majesty to let me make a trip to England in the eventuality that the situation becomes more troublesome than it is already." The king simply shrugged his shoulders. Montjoie estimates that the Duke of Orléans was too much of a coward to show himself in Paris after the storming of the Bastille. However, this is not true. The fact is that Orléans was plotting to have the king assassinated. Orléans went to see the king to create an alibi for himself. Killing of the king was absolutely necessary because there was no possible way that Orléans could even become lieutenant general of the kingdom as long as the king was alive. Louis XVI had to be put out of the way. Then on July 17th, when the king's carriage reached Paris at Place Louis XV and was prepared to turn in the direction of Rue Royale, a loud fanfare welcomed him by playing the popular song chosen by Bailly himself and entitled Where could we be better than within our family? Montjoie reports the following dramatic sequence that occurred at that moment. An assassin posted by Orléans beyond the river, mounted on some construction material which had been put there for the erection of the Louis XVI bridge, and armed with a rifle of extraordinary caliber, took a shot at the king's coach. From that distance, and in the midst of all of the noise of the crowd and of the musicians, no one heard the shot. The bullet came from behind the king's coach, passed above two armed bourgeois who were standing on the left side, and hit a woman located behind them who had raised herself in order to better see the king. This woman, between 30 and 35 years of age, and of a large stature, was named Anne Félicité Jacqueline Dupretot. She came to the ceremony with two of her friends, one of whom was an ecclesiastic. The unfortunate woman fell into the arms of these two men. As she fell, she put her hand to her breast and uttered in a muffled voice, "I have been hit." She expired 4 minutes later. And I imagine you do not read about her in the history books. I'll have to check on that, though. According to Montjoie, the cadaver of this unfortunate woman was later examined by two doctors affiliated with the Châtelet Tribunal, Dr. Sayen of the University of Paris and Dr. Ruffin, a local surgeon who carried out the autopsy. The angle of penetration of the bullet and its large size confirmed the assumption that the assassin had used a rifle of special caliber, and the shot came from slightly above the crowd and from the other side of the river. My God. An immediate investigation was undertaken, but as soon as it became known that Orléans was behind the coup, the whole affair was silenced. So this capacity to silence things that don't fit the narrative or that are embarrassing or that might not go well for the plotters if it were known generally, this capacity to silence things is not new. Had the king been killed and the Dauphin, the Count of Artois, and Queen Marie Antoinette been forced into exile, as was planned, the Duc d'Orléans would have had a legitimate claim to force a change in the reigning dynasty, since Philippe, Duc d'Anjou, and King of Spain had renounced the French crown by treaty. No one could have stopped him from becoming the Jacobin king. It was only later that the National Assembly passed an edict maintaining the dynasty of Henry IV and Louis XVI by declaring the throne is indivisible and the crown is hereditary from male to male. Oops. 32 minutes. Okay, we'll stop there. I'm going to try to finish up this article next time. I might make some cuts. It's rather long. But I think it's important to look at details, to look at the granular detail of this event and see if we can spot the distinction between the impulse toward freedom, which I think probably we're going to look into Saint-Germain's role in being an instrument of that spirit of freedom on earth, and then counterposed with the forces of deception, of enslavement, of trickery, and imperialism. So that's where I think we're going. And so I hope all is well with you, and until next time,